presenting the most evil killers that Britain will never release because they're on a whole life order. This journey stretches all the way from 1974 to now, our first case being someone who killed again after getting out of prison for a previous murder. Direece Roche became a murderer in 2011 at the age of 16 when, together with his brother, he murdered 23-year-old Adam Steele at a New Year's party. He was released on licence in late 2023, only to go and stab his own great-uncle, 64-year-old Fintan McDwyer, to death in June 2024. Roche claimed that he was only acting in self-defence when his great-uncle caught him trying to steal his dog. However, he stabbed his great-uncle no fewer than 77 times. He got his whole life order in September 2025. Before we meet our next monster, if I've got you hooked on the video so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready, and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. Born in 1998, in March 2025, Kyle Clifford got 3 whole life orders for the 3 murders that he committed in July 2024. This triple killer is going to cost the taxpayer millions because he's paralysed. That means in prison he needs lots of extra care. He paralysed himself in a failed suicide attempt that he made just before he got arrested for the murder of his ex-girlfriend Louise Hunt, her mother Carol, and another sister in the family, Hannah. He committed those murders in the home of his ex-girlfriend on the 9th of July 2024. In addition, he raped Louise and held her captive for 2 hours before murdering her, and the judge of his trial said it must have become obvious to Louise in the course of her captivity that Clifford had already killed her mother. When the man got his 3 whole life orders, he was 26. Steven Sansom is a double murderer. His first murder came in Christmas 1998, where he killed a taxi driver just for a few quid. Then he got out, and for a year or 2 he was fine, didn't get into any trouble, but he kept taking drugs. He got involved with a woman called Gemma Watts, and she was just as bad as him. She liked to BDSM. She used to let Sansom beat the crap out of her, and between the 2 of them they plotted that they would get a woman to come over and hack her to bits or kill her in some way. So then one day they got an ex-girlfriend, or somebody at least that Sansom had dated for a while, by the name of Sarah Mayhew, who in fact was the one who introduced Gemma to Sansom. It's not known exactly what they did to her to cause her death, because when several weeks later her body was found, it was all in pieces and it was very badly decomposed, so it was impossible to trace exactly what had been done to her. Gemma got 30 years for Sarah Mayhew's murder because that was her first murder. In the case of Sansom, however, it was his second murder which led him to getting a whole life order. That came in early 2025. Brian Whitelock, who comes from Swansea in Wales, is another triple murderer. His first 2 victims were Nicky Morgan and Glenn Whitelock. Glenn was his own brother. He killed them in the course of a drink and drugs party over at the home of Nicky Morgan. When he got out, he then was befriended by a lady called Wendy Buckney. She was a 71-year-old lady. She loved her horses. She knew about Brian Whitelock's past, but she believed that everyone deserved a second chance. One day, under the influence of drink and drugs again, just like in the case of his first 2 murders, he went over to Wendy Buckney's home, battered her, did something sexual against her, and then after he finished battering her to death with all kinds of things, including some shelving, he loaded a pile of furniture and things over her body and walked away. He got his whole life prison order in 2024. Marcus Osborne killed his former girlfriend and her new partner in 2023, in the month of May, in Huddersfield, out of sexual jealousy. His ex-girlfriend, a lady called Katie Highton, who was 27, sustained all of 99 injuries in the attack from Osborne, while her new boyfriend, a guy called Mr. Harnett, was mutilated and left with 24 knife wounds. Osborne also raped another woman who he had held captive in the house. Osborne got his whole life order in early 2024.
This is a case of such exceptional seriousness that even a very long minimum term would not amount to just punishment. What you did that night was horrific.
In November 2024, Marcus Osborne's appeal against his whole life order was dismissed. Lawrence Bierton, who was born in 1959, is a triple murderer. On the 25th of June 1995, 79-year-old Aileen Duddill and her 72-year-old sister Elsie Gregory discovered their gardeners, Lawrence Bierton and Michael Pluck, stealing from them. Bierton and Pluck reacted by bludgeoning and suffocating the sisters to death. They then piled the sisters' living room furniture over the bodies of their victims and set everything on fire. Both men were jailed for life at Sheffield Crown Court in 1996. In February 2012, Pluck died in prison. Bierton, however, was released from prison on licence in 2017. He was recalled to prison in 2018 but released on licence once again in 2020. On the 9th of November 2021 in Worksop, Nottinghamshire, Bierton battered his 73-year-old neighbour, Pauline Quinn, to death with her own coffee table. The cause of death was traumatic head injuries. Bierton's abuse of drug and alcohol was considered by the prosecution to be a contributing factor to the man's acts. Bierton got his whole life order in 2023. Is this woman a nurse by the name of Lucy Letby, who was born in January 1990, a serial killer?
Yeah, not a problem.
Well, according to a jury, a serial killer whose victims were all defenceless newborn babies is exactly what Lucy Letby is.
This was a cruel, calculated and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children, knowing that your actions were causing significant physical suffering and would cause untold mental suffering.
But just who is Lucy Letby? Everyone always talks about how normal Lucy Letby seemed to everyone. She had a good circle of friends, a great social life, went on holidays with her colleagues. At work, people liked her well enough. She had a bit of a fling with a married doctor. She murdered babies and attempted to murder them by injecting insulin and air into their bloodstream. Lucy Letby's murder trial lasted nearly a year. It finished in summer 2023 and Letby got 14 whole life orders. 7 for her 7 murder convictions and the other 7 for her 7 attempted murder convictions. And then in 2024, following a retrial relating to an 8th charge of attempted murder, she was convicted and received her 15th whole life order. There are lots of people who say that Lucy Letby is a scapegoat. The deaths of those newborn babies, who I think were all premature, were due to clinical errors of other people.
We did not find any murders. In all cases, death or injury were due to natural causes or just bad medical care. There were serious problems related to medical care of patients at this hospital. There were problems related to teamwork and interdisciplinary collaboration at the Countess of Chester Neonatal Unit.
There were plausible reasons, very, very plausible reasons for these babies' deaths, and that there was a combination, if you take the totality of the 17 cases, there was a combination of babies being in the wrong place, delivered in the wrong place, delayed diagnosis, and inappropriate or absent treatment.
I can see Lucy Letby's story continuing to unravel for years to come. I don't know how the police missed in their initial pat-down of Louis De Zoysa, which they performed when they arrested him on the 25th of September 2020, the gun that he had on him. With that gun, in the police station down in Croydon, the man shot and killed Sergeant Matt Ratana.
Your detention's not been authorised yet, but I can authorise a search of you under section 54 of PACE. Stand up. Mate, you're good enough to...
Matt, you alright? I want to take them! Matt, right, I'll blow it! Matt, come away, stop it! Jackie!
The two shots with which De Zoysa murdered Sergeant Matt Ratana came from the antique revolver that he was carrying on him, but as I say, the police missed it when they searched him on the street. Of the two further shots that De Zoysa then fired, one got him himself in the neck and caused brain damage, as a result of which he's now in a wheelchair and can't communicate properly. Basically, he can't speak. De Zoysa got his whole life order in 2023, and then in 2025, his appeal against his whole life order was dismissed. Damien Bendall committed his horrendous acts under the influence of drugs. He murdered, first of all, his girlfriend, who was pregnant with his child. Then he murdered her two young children. And then he murdered the school friend of one of the children who was staying over. This all took place in the Derbyshire town of Killamarsh in September 2021. He also confessed to the rape of one of the children, a little girl.
Right,
so
we told you, I know what's going to happen to you now, mate.
Well, I know what's going to happen
just
when we go to prison, obviously, but again.
Why, what have you done? Have you done something to anyone else?
Yeah.
What have you done?
I've murdered 4 people.
Bendall got his whole life order in 2022.
All the actions I'm about to take are warranted, believe me.
Hakeem Kigundu is a double killer. He is an illegal immigrant who was able to get into the UK using his brother's passport. He was persistently antisocial in the block of flats where he lived, and that led to him getting an eviction notice, his response to which being to set fire to the block of flats, which killed Richard Burgess and Neil Morris. He turned himself into the police and was very casual about what he'd done, saying that he was justified in what he'd done.
All the actions I'm about to take are warranted, believe me.
I just really wanted to turn myself in. Earlier today I did something I'm starting to regret.
Okay. What did you do earlier?
I did a bit of arson. Yeah, to be honest, I think I was just, I don't know if I had like a mini breakdown, but I was just filled with fury.
He got his whole life order in 2022. Ali Harbi Ali is an Islamic terrorist. In October 2021, he murdered Conservative MP Sir David Amis. He stabbed him more than 20 times while attending a constituency surgery. Ali pleaded not guilty to murder, but then didn't dispute much of the evidence against him in court. He had also plotted to murder other MPs, all in revenge against those, including Amis, who had voted for airstrikes against Syria. He got his whole life order in 2022. In October 2020, over a period of 7 days, Anthony Russell murdered 3 people. On the 23rd of October 2020, a lady called Julie Williams, 58, phoned West Midlands Police to report that her son, David Williams, 31, hadn't been seen since the 21st of October. On the 25th of October, West Midlands Police were called by Miss Williams' sister to report that Miss Williams herself, Julie Williams, was now also missing. Police officers forced their way into Miss Williams' house and found her dead on the living room floor. Russell, of course, knew that the police were onto him and went on the run. Before he claimed his final victim, he attacked 2 other people who happened to be elderly people. He then tricked 31-year-old Nicole McGregor, who at the time was 18 weeks pregnant, into meeting him in a secluded spot on the promise of drugs, and that's where he murdered her. Russell got his whole life order in March 2022. For many years, David Fuller, who was an electrician in a hospital in Kent, which has since been closed down, got away with the two murders that he committed. They were of Wendy Nell, who was 25, and Caroline Pearce, who was 20. He committed those down in Royal Tunbridge, Wales. They were known as the bedsit murders. He was eventually caught for those murders and given a whole life order, and along with that he was given a sentence of 12 years for the SA of more than 100 female corpses in 2 hospital mortuaries, and he did those offences over a period of 12 years. The judge of Fuller's trial said that Fuller, quote, had no regard for the dignity of the dead, unquote. Fuller's whole life order came in 2021. Wayne Couzens was a Metropolitan Police officer who, on the 3rd of March 2021, down in Clapham, South London, stopped a random woman on the street whose name was Sarah Everard and who was a 33-year-old marketing executive, falsely told her that she was in breach of lockdown restrictions because this was in the time of COVID, and that because of that he was arresting her. What he actually did was to drive her all the way down to Kent, grape her and then strangle her to death with his police belt. Only 5 days later, though, the police were at his home, placing him under arrest and interrogating him in relation to the abduction of Sarah Everard.
Well, I am in financial shit, and I've been lent on by, I don't know who they are. They're a group, a gang, whatever, and they told me, right, I need to go and pick up girls and give them to them. There's a couple of names. I was told a place to take her. That's it. That is all I know.
Yeah, he'd had no preparation time whatsoever for that load of codswallop, so that load of codswallop was the best he could come up with, as I say, having had no time to prepare. There was a subsequent inquiry into the behaviour of Wayne Couzens during his career as a police officer, and it was concluded that there were so many missed opportunities to disrupt and halt the man's offending. He did things like flashing on a number of occasions. He was addicted to extreme pornography and tried to get his colleagues to watch it with him. He had a warning at one point for being excessively violent during an arrest. He went missing at one point. He was in loads and loads of debt, and when that happens, a police officer can be kicked out of the force because having money problems makes them more susceptible to bribery and corruption. Couzens got his whole life order in 2021. His appeal against that sentence that came in 2022 was swiftly dismissed.
Couzens seeks leave to appeal against sentence. In his case, we grant leave to appeal against sentence but dismiss the appeal.
On the 20th of June 2020, in Forbury Gardens, a public park located in Reading, Berkshire, Khairi Saadallah stabbed to death James Furlong, 36, David Wales, 49, and Joe Ritchie Bennett, 39. It was a terrorist atrocity. The judge of the trial, Mr. Justice Sweeney, said, quote, "During the course of the attack and afterwards, and because he was seeking to advance a political, religious or ideological cause, the defendant was shouting in Arabic, 'God is the greatest and God accept my jihad,' unquote." Saadallah picked up his whole life order in 2021. Mark Fellows got his whole life order for the 2 murders that he committed that he was paid to commit. He worked by day as a sous chef but had a side hustle, you see, as a hitman. He was affiliated with the anti-A-Team gang of Salford, who were deadly rivals, literally, of the A-Team gang, who were being mentored by Paul Massey. In 2015, Fellows shot Paul Massey dead, and then 3 years later he shot dead another well-known gangster, John Kinsella, and it was the murder of John Kinsella that got the police on his scent. One of the incriminating pieces of evidence against Fellows was his GPS watch, which showed that he'd done a recce of Paul Massey's whereabouts. In November 2025, which is 6 years after Fellows got his whole life order. That came in 2019. Fellows got into the news again because he was charged alongside 2 others with the murder of Kyle Bevan, a prisoner at HMP Wakefield where Fellows is, who himself was in there for child murder. One of the other 2 people who've been charged with Bevan's murder is Lee Newell. He's another whole life order prisoner, and I'll be coming on to him. John Taylor got his first life sentence for a string of sexual offences that he committed from 1977 to 1987, and they include some of the most horrendous types of sexual offences that there are. Alongside those offences were grievous bodily harm and many, many other offences. He got his second life sentence in June 2002 for the murder of Leanne Tiernan, and that second life sentence in fact turned into a whole life order imposed on him in 2018. Eerily enough, before jointly murdering a lady called Quen Ngok Nguyen in August 2017, Stephen Unwin and William McFall had each murdered a pensioner and done time for that. They got Miss Nguyen to come to a property under false pretences, and then Unwin raped her, and then afterwards he drove her to a remote location and set her on fire. He then drove to a cash machine and withdrew money from her bank account while the lady burned. The 2 men got their whole life order in 2018. Alan Maidman has got convictions for robberies and for possessing a knife, and for 2 murders. He got his first murder conviction and he served his time, and then he got out. But then 9 months later, in 2017, he murdered again. It was a man that he believed had assaulted his girlfriend. He murdered that man by stabbing him 32 times. He got his whole life order in 2017. John Wass is in the same position as Jeremy Wing on a whole life order for a crime other than murder. Wass was 69 when he was convicted of 17 counts of historical child abuse. Can't say the word because of YouTube's decency policies. And these offences included grape, SA and sexual exposure against 3 different victims going back to the 60s. He got his whole life tariff at Derby Crown Court in 2017. Billy White. He murdered his girlfriend, Lucy Aries, in 2015, and then he got sentenced to 15 years as the minimum term of his life sentence. But then when he was in prison, like others before him, he murdered a fellow prisoner, someone called Brett Rogers. And the man himself was a convicted murderer. But as I say, murderers murdering other murderers, it's still murder, and it doesn't make any of them a hero. This was again at HMP Long Lartin, which is in Worcestershire. He got a whole life order in 2017. Leroy Campbell embarked on his career as a violent criminal with the offence of rape. He did 17 years for the grape of a woman. After that, when he got out, he then raped as well as murdered a nurse called Lisa Skidmore by strangling her with a ligature. This was in Bilston. He also then tried to murder the woman's mother by strangling her with a vacuum cord. Then he tried to cover his tracks by setting fire to Lisa's room and leaving items with other people's DNA on them. The man had only been released 4 months earlier after the 17 years that he did for grape. He got his well-deserved whole life order in 2017. Stephen Port, who was born in 1975, is not only a serial killer but also a serial rapist. Between 2014 and 2015, Paul murdered 4 young men that he met online. He'd get them to come over to his flat over in Barking in East London, and there he would drug them with GHB, gamma hydroxybutyric acid, quite a well-known date grape drug, and then of course grape them. And all 4 victims died from an overdose of the drug. In the case of one victim, Paul inserted the drug, or rather injected it, directly into the man's you-know-what hole. Paul got his whole life order in 2016. To this day, though, apparently he denies any of the murders. During the Brexit vote of 2016, Thomas Mair, a far-right activist, anti-immigration, anti-anything that isn't white and British, murdered Labour MP Joe Cox. He did that in Birstall in West Yorkshire on the 16th of June 2016. Mair had researched and laid out an assassination plan, and at the point when he attacked Joe Cox, a member of the public tried to rescue her, but Mair then attacked him and stabbed him. And I'm really sorry to say that I don't know either the name of that wonderful man or what became of him. Mair got his whole life order in 2016. Arthur Simpson-Kent murdered his partner, who was a former EastEnders actress called Cyan Blake, and she was 43, and he also killed their two sons, Zachary, aged 8, and Amon, aged 4. He did so by beating and stabbing all three of them at their home in Erith in London in December 2015. Police believe that Simpson-Kent committed the murders because Cyan was planning to leave him. He buried the bodies of the three victims in the garden and then ran away to Ghana, but he was later caught and brought back to the UK. He got his whole life order in October 2016. On the 19th of October 2012, Christopher Halliwell pleaded guilty to the murder of Sian O'Callaghan, a lady that he'd picked up outside a nightclub in Swindon in March 2011 before stabbing her to death. He got life with a minimum of 25 years. While he was under arrest for Sian's murder, he confessed to killing another woman several years earlier, the lady being 20-year-old Becky Godden, but the High Court decided that his confession wasn't admissible because in some way it had been obtained illegally. Thankfully, 4 years later, police found fresh evidence unconnected to Halliwell's earlier confession, and on that evidence he was convicted of Becky Gordon's murder, and on the basis of that second murder conviction he got his whole life order. That came in 2016. Anthony Ayres, another man who killed two women several years apart, with a prison sentence for the first murder coming in between. So his first murder is the one that he committed in 1994, and the woman that he murdered was none other than his girlfriend. After he got out, which he did in May 2012, he kept a low profile for 3 years, and then on the 19th of November 2015, for whatever reason, he murdered 36-year-old mother of one, Kelly Pearce, at a friend's flat in Canvey in Essex. He stabbed Kelly 40 times and then beat her to death. He got his whole life order in 2016. Russell Oliver, yet another prisoner who's inside for murder and commits a murder again while inside. On the 31st of May 2015, Russell Oliver, who was then aged 46, attacked another prisoner called John York in his cell at the high security prison HMP Long Lartin. York himself was jailed for life in 2013 for beating a man to death. He died from the head injuries that Oliver inflicted on him. Oliver got his whole life order in 2016. Ian Birley's first murder was that of 69-year-old Maurice Hoyle, and for that murder he did 18 years. And then in July 2015, when he was 43, together with his girlfriend, a 39-year-old called Helen Nichols, he followed a 65-year-old man called John Gogarty to his home in Roomwell, which is near Barnsley in South Yorkshire, before demanding his PIN and then stabbing him 69 times. The girlfriend, Helen Nichols, got 20 years for the murder, while Birley got whole life. That happened in 2015. Born in 1970 or thereabouts, in 2001, Jason Gomez stabbed his business partner, Robert Jones, to death. I believe their business was a window cleaning business. Then on the 25th of March 2015, together with a fellow inmate called Paul Watkin, Gomez lured another inmate called Darren Flynn into a cell at HMP Swellside and then stabbed him over 190 times with a thin black handle and a knife wrapped in material. I have no idea why the two men did what they did to the victim. Gomez got his whole life order in 2015. Double murderer David Mitchell, who was born around 1968, is gay. However, originally he was straight. The proof of that is the fact that in 1990 he murdered his girlfriend. He did his second murder, which was that of his gay lover, Robert Hind, 4 months after getting out of prison for the murder of his girlfriend. He murdered Robert Hind in the hostel that they were both living in after getting out of prison, where they met in December 2013. And his apparent reason for the murder was that he was really angry when, after they had sex, Hind told him that he was HIV positive. The court, however, when this came to trial, didn't believe him for a minute. They reckoned that he had known about it long before then, and therefore that wasn't the reason why he killed Robert Hind. He got his whole life order in 2015. Ryan Matthews committed 2 murders and got life for those murders in 1983. On getting out, he went and murdered a healthcare assistant called Sharon Wall at Wootton Hill Hospital in Gloucester. He did that on the 9th of July 2014. Matthews left Broadmoor Secure Hospital in 1999 under the Mental Health Act, and his mental health had deteriorated throughout stays in various hospitals following his release. Matthews, who used to be known as Stephen Cecil King, got his whole life order in 2015. Paul O'Hara's first murder was that of his girlfriend, Janine Waterworth, in, I think, 1998, or at least that's when he was sentenced for her murder. And then he was released around 2013. And of course, on being released, he went over to the home of his new girlfriend, Sherilee Shenan, and that's where she was given evidence to 2 police officers about the domestic abuse that she'd suffered at the hands of O'Hara. He burst in, attacked the 2 police officers with a hammer, chased Shenan into the street, and then on catching up with her, he stabbed her to death. He got his whole life order in 2014.
Looks good.
Thanks, Matt. That makes me feel so good. Real sexy.
This woman has just been arrested on suspicion of 3 murders and 2 attempted murders, and yet she's laughing and flirting with police officers, acting as if she's just been arrested for something like stealing a charger.
Not a t-shirt, it's a tent.
Joanne, signature from you that we've got your property.
Right, so what am I up for? Attempted murder and murder.
You've been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder and murder.
Attempted murder and murder, something. So going down for Sunday Rose? Excuse me.
The 3 men that Joanna Dennehy murdered in March 2013 were none other than her friends, her sexual partners to be exact. When she was little, Joanna Dennehy was a very kind, caring, sensitive girl, very close to her sister. She was a very academically gifted pupil who had aspirations of becoming a lawyer, until one day in her teens, for reasons that people just can't explain, she changed. She got into drugs, she got into drink, she got into sex. She ran off with a bloke who was a lot older than her that she came onto, had a couple of babies with him. Then that relationship broke down. She went to prison, came out, got in with some really, really dodgy characters, and then in March 2013 killed 3 people and tried to kill another 2. She said that the reason she did it is because she wanted to see if she was as evil and as cold-hearted as she thought she was, and that after she killed the first person, she had to keep going. It was moreish and she couldn't get enough. She was convicted in 2014 along with the 3 men, her so-called undertakers that had helped her, in particular by getting rid of the bodies. And in fact, Joanna Dennehy's killings were known as the Peterborough ditch murders because they dumped the bodies in a ditch out in Peterborough in Cambridgeshire. The 3 accomplices were given finite terms, and I think at least one of them has since been released. Dennehy herself got her whole life order in 2014. On the afternoon of the 22nd of May 2013, a British Army soldier, drummer Lee Rigby of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, was attacked and killed by Michael Adibolajo and Michael Adibowale near the Royal Artillery Barracks in Woolwich, south-east London. Both men were Muslim converts. 29-year-old Adibolajo was found guilty of Rigby's murder on the 19th of December 2013, and so was Adibowale. On the 26th of February 2014, Adibolajo was sentenced at the Central Criminal Court to a whole life order. Adibowale didn't get whole life, but he did get 45 years as a minimum term, in something of a shocking twist. Years later, in 2018 to be exact, Adibolajo said that he regretted doing what he did to Lee Rigby. He said that he did it because he had misinterpreted the Quran to justify his actions and that he'd been brainwashed. Lee's mother, however, whose name is Lynn Rigby, wouldn't accept his apology and said that she would never forgive him. Ian McLoughlin was born in 1958. Between 1970 and 1983, he was in and out of prison for a range of offences, including burglary and theft. In 1983, he beat his boyfriend, Lendell Gatti, over the head with a hammer and then strangled him with a towel. He was convicted of manslaughter and got 10 years, but that was reduced on appeal to 8 years, and then the man was released after only 5 years anyway. In September 1991, he got his new boyfriend, a barman called Peter Halls, to lie on the bed in a fantasy game and then killed him by stabbing him in the back. In 1992, he got life with a minimum of 25 years. In July 2012, he was let out of prison on day release, and he decided to use that day release to go around the home of ex-prisoner and SE ex-offender, 86-year-old Francis Corey Wright, who he'd met in prison, and rob him. And so that's what he did. He tied Corey Wright up while he searched his house, and he was just about to leave with a pillowcase full of family heirlooms when a neighbour by the name of Graham Buck came over to investigate the shouting that he'd heard. McLoughlin dragged Mr. Buck into the house and then killed him by stabbing him in the neck. In 2014, the 40-year minimum term that McLoughlin had got in 2013 for the murder of Mr. Buck was upgraded to a whole life order. For reasons that aren't known to anyone other than the perpetrator, in 2013, former soldier Anwar Rossa, who was born around 1980, murdered a 4-year-old boy who lived in the home that Anwar Rossa had been allowed to stay in for the night. I can't find exactly how Rossa did what he did, but having been described as a psychotic, bullying alcoholic, he murdered the little boy, whose name is Riley Turner, while the little boy was sleeping. He got his whole life order in 2014. In 2013, Jamie Reynolds, who was born around 1990, murdered the 17-year-old daughter of a police officer and then had SEX with her dead body. And he did all of this after spending months writing a twisted tale describing how he would do it. He first of all built a so-called hanging mechanism in the loft hatch of his parents' home over in Wellington in Telford. And then at some point he was able to somehow lure Georgia Williams, an A-level student, over to his home for a fake photo shoot. Georgia agreed to pose for Reynolds while wearing lipstick, stilettos and leather shorts, which he had bought on the internet. In a picture found by the police, Georgia can be seen grinning at the camera with a noose around her neck on the landing of the house. And then moments later, Reynolds throttled his victim with the rope before hanging her from the noose in order to fulfill his sick fantasies, which had been fueled by his obsession with violent pornography. When he was caught, Reynolds was examined by psychiatrists who all agreed that if he hadn't been caught, he would have gone on to become a serial killer. He got his whole life order in 2013. Lee Newell and Gary Smith are a joint case. They were both inside on a life sentence with a minimum term for an initial murder. And then in 2013, they murdered another prisoner in HMP Long Lartin, who himself was a child murderer. His name was Subhan Anwar, and for that they both got a whole life order. And then in November 2014, Lee Newell himself was nearly murdered by another prisoner by the name of Gary Vinter, who's also a double murderer and also doing a whole life order. Vinter kicked and stomped Newell to within inches of his life. Newell recovered, but he lost the sight in one eye and he got £85,000 compensation for that. In November 2025, despite having no sight in one eye and despite being 56 and despite already having done 2 murders, he was charged with the murder of child killer Kyle Bevan in HMP Wakefield, and 2 others were charged with him, one of which I've already mentioned, Mark Fellows. Dale Cregan, who comes from Manchester, has murdered 4 people in total. He murdered a father and son over something ridiculously petty that started in a pub. Then the police started investigating, and that meant having to question relatives and friends of Dale Cregan, and that really irritated Cregan, so in revenge he made a hoax call to the police saying that someone had smashed one of his windows in. 2 police officers turned up, Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone, and Cregan shot at them and threw a grenade at them and murdered them in that way. He then turned himself in. His murders of Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone came in 2012. He got his whole life order in 2013. Even though the body of 5-year-old Welsh girl April Jones has never been found, Mark Bridger, who was born around 1966, is doing a whole life order for her murder. Around 7:30 on the 1st of October 2012, after letting her little girl play out, April's mother couldn't find April and she straight away called 999. The first officer on the scene spoke to a child's witness who reported having seen April climbing into a grey van. The police immediately upgraded the investigation to a critical incident and launched a massive search for April, which soon brought them to the front door of Mark Bridger. Bridger said that he had accidentally run April over, but that, due to having been drunk, he couldn't remember what he'd done with the body. Nobody believed him, and in 2013, after being found guilty of April's abduction and murder, and also of perverting the course of justice, he got his whole life prison order. Andrew Dawson, who was born in 1962, has killed all of 3 people in his lifetime, and he did so between 1981 and 2010. In August 1981, in his native Ormskirk up in Lancashire, Dawson murdered his first victim, Henry Walsh. Mr. Walsh was a shopkeeper who was 91 years old at the time of his murder, and Dawson stabbed the man 11 times. Dawson was convicted of Mr. Walsh's murder in 1982, but was released on licence in 1999. On the 25th of July 2010, John David Matthews was found stabbed to death in his flat in the Derby area of Chaddesden. 5 days later, in the same area, Paul Hancock was also fatally stabbed. And you'll never guess who stabbed them both. On both occasions, Dawson placed the bodies of his victims in a bathtub of their respective flat so that he could get rid of their odours. On the same day that Matthew's body had been found, Dawson was arrested in Whitehaven, which is in Cumbria. On the 18th of July 2011, he got his whole life order. David Baxendale was born in 1971. In 2001, out in Spain, he got 11 years for the murder of his friend, who he stabbed 14 times while he was under the influence of drink and drugs. After only 7 years, though, in June 2008, he was released and deported back to the UK. On the 10th of May 2010, a friend of his who lived in a flat in Redhill, he met this lady called Sarah Thomas, and the two seemed to have, got a liking for one another, and then they got a taxi back to Sarah's flat around 5 p.m. She lived in High Street, Nutfield Village, and then for reasons that I just don't know, Baxendale murdered her. He stabbed her several times with the fatal wound going straight through her neck. In March 2011, Baxendale got his whole life prison order. John William Cooper, who was born in 1944, is also known as the Bullseye Killer, and he's a Welsh serial killer. On the 26th of May 2011, he was given a whole life order for the 1985 double murder of siblings Richard and Helen Thomas, and for the 1989 double murder of Peter and Gwenda Dixon. The murders were known in the media as the Pembrokeshire murders or the Coastal murders, because that's where the murders took place, and because of those murders, tourism in that area dropped dramatically. Cooper was also sentenced for the rape of a 16-year-old girl and a assault on a 15-year-old girl. Both of those attacks having been carried out while a group of 5 teenagers were held at gunpoint in March 1996 in a wooded area behind the Mount Estate in Cooper's hometown of Milford Haven in Pembrokeshire. George Johnson is a double murderer. He did 20 years of a life sentence for a murder that he committed in the course of a burglary that came in 1986. Then when he got out in 2011, he murdered 89-year-old Florence Habish in February in order to get money to fund his drug addiction. It was a fully premeditated murder as well. He got his whole life order in 2011. John Sweeney, who was born in 1958, murdered 2 girlfriends of his 10 years apart and was already banged up for the attempted murder of another girlfriend of his when he learned that he was getting a whole life order for his 2 murders. A carpenter, Sweeney murdered Melissa Halstead, 33, a former model from Ohio in the US in 1990, before murdering Paula Fields, 31, a mother of 3 living in North London in 2000. He hacked each woman to death, dismembered them each, and then dumped their remains in canals in London and in Rotterdam. Likewise, he attempted to kill a 3rd girlfriend with both an axe and a knife. I have no idea why the man did what he did. Police, furthermore, think he may have committed 3 other murders too. Sweeney got his whole life order in 2011. Between 2009 and 2010, Stephen Griffiths, who comes from Bradford in Yorkshire, murdered 3 women, 43-year-old Susan Rushworth, 31-year-old Shirley Armitage, and 36-year-old Suzanne Blamyers. All 3 women happened to be sex workers. Griffiths killed his victims with a crossbow and also claimed to have cannibalised any one or more of them, although that latter claim has never been proven. He got his whole life order in 2010, and while in prison he has attempted suicide on several occasions, but staff have always caught him in time. And in 2011 he went on a 120-day hunger strike, during which time he avoided contact with other people. But there is such a crazy irony to this guy's story. In 2009, he went to the University of Bradford to write a PhD in homicide studies. Wilbur Anthony Dice is a triple murderer. In 1982, he killed a mother and her 2 young daughters, and he also raped the mother. Initially, the murder was treated as racially motivated, since racist slogans had been spray painted over the walls of the family's home. However, Dice was, after many years, linked to the crimes by advances in DNA technology, and it was established that Dice himself had painted those racist slogans on the walls to throw the police off his scent. He got his whole life order in 2010. Born in 1971, in 1989, Desmond Lee murdered his landlady, Shirley Carr, by strangling her with his bare hands. His reason for killing her was that she had taunted him over the breakup of his first gay relationship. He pled not guilty to murder but was convicted anyway, and he did 14 years, and he got out in 2004. Now, after getting out, he got a new boyfriend, a man called Christopher Pratt, who was actually a married father of 2. And then on one occasion, the 15th of August 2009 to be exact, over at Mr. Pratt's home in Sackville Street, Lee killed his lover by breaking his voice box and by breaking a bone in his neck. The body of Mr. Pratt was still in the flat when Lee stole the man's credit card and debit cards, and with those cards he paid off a phone bill, bought alcohol for a party with his neighbours, ordered more than £200 worth of food from Asda, and attempted to buy £1,181 worth of goods from Argos. In court, this time he admitted to killing Mr. Pratt, but he claimed it was a freak sex accident. In April 2010, he got his whole life order. On the 3rd of April 2010, John Maiden, who had an obsessive interest in pornography that related to you-know-what-ophilia, rape and torture, called his sister Lynn and asked for Lynn's daughter, his niece, to go to his home in Cheetham Hill in order to babysit his 10-year-old daughter. When Tia arrived, which was at 3 p.m, her uncle drugged her with an antipsychotic tranquilizer that he himself had been prescribed. After doing so, he inflicted a horrific catalogue of injuries on his niece before stabbing her and then strangling her with a ligature made from a guitar string. At 3:45 p.m, Madden phoned the 999 emergency services and said, quote, "Hi, I would like to report a murder," unquote. And then when he was asked by the operator what had happened, or rather why he had done what he had done, he answered, quote, "Because I felt like it," unquote. He got his whole life order in October 2010. Mark Chivers, who was born in 1967, is the son of a British Army officer who was serving in Germany. Chivers was born and raised in Germany. In 1986, he met a lady called Sabine Rappold, and she soon became his girlfriend. In 1992, he strangled her with a rope and then buried her body in a shallow grave in Woodland and went on the run. He was caught and arrested 3 months later, and in 1993 he got a life sentence in Stuttgart. After doing 15 years for the murder of Sabine, in 2007 he was released but deported back to the UK. In July 2008, he had a girlfriend by this point and he attacked her. Her name was Maria Stubbings. He got 4 months in jail for battery of Maria, but they stayed together, and there were a number of other occasions when Chivers got out that Maria called the police on him, but nothing came of it until one point the police came round after Maria Stubbings got them over, but Chivers is the one who answered the door, and he told the police that she'd gone out. And then a few days later, in fact it was the very next day, they came round the first occasion on the 18th of December 2008. Then they came back the next day and they found Maria's body, which was hidden under a pile of clothes in the downstairs bathroom. This time Chivers strangled her with a dog lead. Perhaps he just didn't have any rope handy. He got his whole life order in December 2009. While Simon Wilson, who was born in 1957, is a murderer, his whole life order doesn't come directly from his act of murder. On being moved to Australia with his family at the age of 2, Wilson racked up a total of 77 offences over there, including 6 rapes and a vicious murder. After serving 16 years in prison for that murder, in January 2008, at 50, Wilson was deported back to England. On his return to the UK, however, the man learned that his case was found not to meet the criteria to put him under any control orders, which left him free to do whatever he wanted and go wherever he wanted. Likewise, the authorities were powerless to force Wilson to sign the SE ex-offender register, the man choosing not to do so on a voluntary basis. A few months on, in September 2008, the man was given a whole life order after pleading guilty to attempted rape, wounding with intent, and causing a person to engage in sexual activity without her consent. In April 2008, you see, Wilson attacked a 71-year-old woman, who we'll call Lucy, on her doorstep in central London, slashing her across the face and across her body as he tried to rape her. Lucy had to be hospitalised for 5 days and was left so badly injured from the attack that she was at risk of losing the use of one of her arms. Wilson lost his 2009 appeal against his whole life order. As a convicted murderer, however, he isn't quite in the same category as either Jeremy Wing or another non-murderer whole lifer, John Wass, who you're soon to meet. Gary Vinter has committed 2 murders. The first one he committed in August 1995, and it was that of a local railway worker called Carl Eden. He did time for that, got out in 2007, but then in February 2008, he strangled to death his wife, Anne White, in Teesside in the northeast of England, and got himself a whole life order because of that. In 2014, he nearly killed another prisoner who was also a double murderer, doing a whole life order, Lee in Newell, his reason having been that it was taking too long for him to be transferred to a prison with a better gym. He's also attacked Roy Whiting, who killed Sarah Payne, a schoolgirl aged 8. He stuck the sharpened end of a toilet brush into the man's eyes. The man, however, recovered. Vinter got his whole life order in 2008. Levi Belfield is literally evil by name. Born in 1968, he's a serial killer, a sex offender, a rapist, a kidnapper and a burglar. He's also a woman beater. He had numerous relationships which spawned him, I think, 10 or 11 children, and many of those relationships collapsed because he used to beat the you-know-what out of his girlfriends and wives. He was married to some of them and just living with others just as a boyfriend and girlfriend set up. In 2008, he was convicted of the murders of Marsha McDonnell and Emily de la Grange and of the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy, and he got a whole life order. And then in 2011, he was found guilty of the murder of schoolgirl Millie Dowler, and he again received a whole life order for that murder as well. So he's got 2 whole life orders, and he was in fact the first prisoner in the UK to receive 2 whole life orders. Steve Wright, who was born in 1958, is known in the media as the Suffolk Strangler, the man behind the Ipswich serial killings of late 2006. Between the 30th of October and the 10th of December 2006, the bodies of 5 women, who all happened to be sex workers, were discovered at different locations near Ipswich in Suffolk, England. While their bodies were discovered naked, there were no signs of SA. 2 of the victims, Annalie Alderton and Paula Clennell, were confirmed to have been killed by strangling. The cause of death of the other 3 victims, Gemma Adams, Tanya Nicol and Annette Nichols, was never established, the perpetrator himself staying silent on the matter. Similarly, the man has never said why he killed the 5 women. Was it due to resentment of and disgust for women who sell sex, like the case of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper? Who knows? What is known, though, is that Wright himself was a long-standing user of sex workers. Wright got his whole life order in 2008. Born in 1950, in 1975, Michael Smith met a 19-year-old woman by the name of Sheila Deakin, and the 2 became a couple. However, the relationship was fraught in some way from the very off, and in an argument over a previous boyfriend of Sheila's, Smith strangled his girlfriend to death. Smith did 30 years for that murder. He learned nothing from that punishment, though, since in August 2006 he battered his mate Peter Summers to death with a champagne bottle before stealing 8,000 quid from the man's home, this having been his reason for what he did. With that second murder, in May 2007, Smith got forever, a whole life prison sentence, of course. Born in 1960, in 1995, David Tiley got 6 years for double rape. In March 2007, no more than 2 weeks after getting out, after getting into an argument with his fiancée, Susan Hale, in which she taunted him about something from his past, he stabbed the woman to death. This took place at their home in Southampton, South England. Susan was a disabled person, which was due to a degenerative brain disorder that made it really hard for her to walk. 8 days later, when Susan's carer, a married mother of 2 called Sarah Merritt, came round to give Susan a bath, Tiley tied her up, took her bank card and then went out and got 150 quid out with it. On returning, the man raped Mrs. Merritt and then stabbed her to death. He got his whole life order in June 2007. Before the moment when he murdered his 7-week-old baby daughter, which he did by throwing her head first onto a settee, Andrew Randall, who came from Kettering in Northamptonshire, had, on previous occasions, kicked the baby across the floor, stamped on her chest and put his fingers down her throat. He had also essayed her. After getting caught, he told police officers that he resented his 7-week-old baby daughter and that he had done so since the moment she was born. By the recognised criminal justice process, the man got his whole life order in 2007. by prison justice. In 2011, he was stabbed in the eye and had his throat slashed. This took place in Longlartin. When Rashan Arshad murdered his wife and their 3 children in a so-called honour killing, he felt, quote, totally justified in what he did, unquote. That quotation comes from the police who were involved in the case. A 36-year-old taxi driver, Arshad beat his wife and 3 children to death with a rounder's bat at their home in Cheadle-Hulme, Manchester in July 2006. This then is how Uzma Rayhan, 32, Adam, 11, Abbas, 8 and Henna, 6 all lost their lives. According to investigating officers, Arshad felt his wife had brought the killing on herself by having an affair. This adulterous behaviour of Uzma's shamed the whole family, meaning that they all had to die, except the husband. If you're thinking that, at the very least, the 3 children, who were wholly innocent for crying out loud, should have been spared, sometime after getting caught, Arshad expressed regret for killing them. He got his forever prison sentence in 2007. Stephen McCall is a former gangster who got his whole life order in 2006 for 2 murders. His first victim was a man called Michael Doran, who was a member of his gang, and the reason he killed him was that he suspected him of being an informer for Greater Manchester Police. And yet, crazily enough and ironically enough, after he killed Michael Doran, he himself became an informer for Greater Manchester Police. The man's second victim was a man called Philip Noakes, whose crime against McCall was to have publicly humiliated him. Born in 1977, in 1993, John McGrady was sent to prison for 5 years for false imprisonment of a young woman that he had abducted at knife point as she got off a bus. In 1998, the man was jailed for 6 years for raping and essaying 2 women that he knew. On the 25th of September 2005, Rochelle Holness, a 15-year-old girl who was a neighbour of McGrady's, disappeared after going out to call her boyfriend from a phone box near her home in Lewisham, South London. It's thought that McGrady abducted Rochelle from the phone box at knife point before taking her back to his home, where he strangled and dismembered her. 3 days after doing that, he confessed to his girlfriend what he'd done and then slashed his wrists in a suicide bid, which failed. He got his whole life order in May 2006. As for Victor Dembowskis, for some reason, despite his history of grapes in his home country, Latvia, the man had been allowed to remain in the UK. Sadly for Jeshma Ray Thatha, a 17-year-old A-level student from Harrow in northwest London, this enabled the man in May 2005 to repeatedly grape her and then stab her to death on her way home from school. While the perpetrator got his whole life order for his atrocious acts against Jeshma in 2006, the effects of those acts didn't end. Unable to cope with what had happened to her big sister, you see, in 2009, at the age of 15, Jeshma's kid sister, Nishma, threw herself off the top of a car park and died from her resultant injuries. Now we've got the joint case of Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey. In 2003, in London, 5 members of an Indian family were kidnapped and murdered by a criminal gang. The millionaire businessman Amarjit Chauhan disappeared along with his wife, his 2 baby sons and his mother-in-law. The bodies were initially buried in Devon before they were later dumped in the sea off Poole in Dorset, where 3 of them were eventually discovered in the English Channel. The bodies of the 2 little boys were never found. Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey were given whole life orders for the 5 murders. Peter Rees was convicted of one of the murders. The motive was financial, as they planned to take over Amarjit Chauhan's freight company, which they then wanted to use as a front for importing drugs. The case was highly publicised due to the sheer brutality of the crime, and the trial was the longest in the history of the Metropolitan Police. Mark Richard Hobson, who was born on the 2nd of September 1969, killed 4 people in North Yorkshire in July 2004. His first murder was that of his very girlfriend, Claire Sanderson, and he killed her at their home, which was near Selby. After that, he lured Claire's twin sister, Diane, to the home and then murdered her several days later. Afterwards, he fled the property and murdered an elderly couple who lived several miles away before going on the run. He was arrested soon after, 8 days after I think, when he was spotted hiding in bushes near a petrol station in North Yorkshire. A bin man who had a history of violence, drug addiction and alcoholism, Hobson pleaded guilty to all the charges against him in April 2005 and got his whole life prison sentence. His subsequent appeal for a lower tariff failed. Mark Martin became a triple murderer because it was his ambition to become Nottingham's first serial killer. His victims were 3 homeless women and he killed them between December 2004 and January 2005. He had 2 accomplices, but they received finite terms. One got 14 years and one got 25 years. Martin got a whole life order in 2005. Thomas McDowell presents another case of someone getting a whole life prison sentence for a single murder. McDowell murdered and dismembered a trainee rabbi by the name of Andreas Hinz, who was German. After murdering him, McDowell dumped the man's head, limbs and torso in bin bags in Camden, North London. McDowell, who had suffered abuse as a child and had grown up hating homosexuals, pled guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. That didn't wash with the jury, however, and he went down for murder and got his whole life prison order. Philip Hegarty got his whole life order for murdering his friend Derek Bennett in a hammer attack in 2003. He later set fire to a Renault Laguna after placing Bennett's body in it, and Bennett's body was so severely burnt that it had to be identified by dental records. Hegarty got his whole life order in 2004. In February 1989, together with a friend of his, 17-year-old Paul Glenn went to steal 5,000 quid from a local guesthouse owner called Ivor Usher. Believing the money was stashed in the safe, the pair tied Mr. Usher to a chair, but for some reason, Glenn suddenly went mad and bludgeoned the man to death with a bar stool and a wrench. Afterwards, in an effort to cover his tracks, he set the place on fire. Glenn was jailed for life, but he got out on licence in 2002 after doing 13 years. On getting out, the man followed in the footsteps of John Childs and became a hitman. Having accepted a contract to kill a bloke called Vincent Smart, armed with a kitchen knife, Glenn travelled down from Liverpool to Farset in Cambridgeshire, where his target lived. On reaching the man's house, Glenn kicked the door down, stormed up to his victim, who was in the middle of making dinner with his girlfriend, and stabbed him repeatedly in the hands, the arms and the chest, one stab going through the man's heart. While Glenn was killing his target, the girlfriend of the victim went and hid behind a sofa. She was unharmed. In 2004, given his previous murder conviction, Glenn got a whole life order. And by the way, in the contract killing that he carried out, he offed the wrong bloke. Mr. Smart wasn't in, you see, when Glenn came calling. His housemate, Robert Bogle, was, and that's who Glenn murdered. The murderer seemed not to have even got the basics of contract killing right, including knowing how one's target actually looks, although arguably his contractors held an equal share of the blame for that. Mr. Bogle was black. Glenn's intended victim, however, was white. Jeremy Wing, who was born around 1941, is one of the only 2 current prisoners who've been given a whole life order for something other than murder. Can you guess what his offences are then? Before he got a forever prison sentence, which he did in 2002, Wing had been inside before for child you know what offences. Sometime after getting out, he fell under suspicion of essaying 3 boys and was subject on that basis to a police raid of his home, which was out in Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire. Not only did the police find in the man's home toys, motorised go-karts, water pistols and video games, they also found video recordings showing Wing, along with another man by the name of Brian Hogg, graping 2 of the 3 boys in question. Wing and Hogg had met in prison where, like Wing, Hogg was doing time for child S-bleep-X offences. The grapes that the 2 PDF files perpetrated against their victims from the early 2000s were so violent that the injuries that they caused to the boys will never heal. I will state at this point that I have no idea how the boys came into the physical control of the 2 twisted antagonists. I don't know how the parents of the boys, or whoever was supposed to be in charge of them, let Wing and Hogg get their hands on them. Wing having begun his abuse of the 2 boys shown in his home movies when they were 7. We'll call those boys Tom and Adam. In 2002, on being convicted of grapes and of other offences relating to Tom and Adam, Wing got his whole life order. So did Hogg, but he later got his whole life sentence quashed and replaced with a shockingly lenient 10-year term. No idea where the man is as at the time of this recording. Peter Moore was born in 1946 and he used to manage cinemas in North Wales. That was when he wasn't committing any of the 4 murders for which he is now rotting in prison under a whole life prison order. Before he took to murder, the man committed no fewer than 39 sex attacks on men in North Wales and in Merseyside over a 20-year period. He committed his 4 murders between September and December 1995. He stabbed his victims and then mutilated them. At trial, he told the jury that the crimes were committed by a fictitious homosexual lover that he nicknamed Jason after the killer in the Friday the 13th horror films. The jury, of course, found him guilty on all 4 counts of murder. In March 2011, Moore challenged his whole life prison sentence in the European Court of Human Rights, and he aimed, in fact, to have the whole life order outlawed throughout Europe. However, he failed. Rose West was born in 1953 in North Devon. Between 1973 and 1987, alongside her husband, she tortured, raped and murdered all of 10 young women. On her own, in 1971, she murdered the stepdaughter of Fred West. By that point, she and Fred had got married and Fred was in prison. She told him what she'd done and he didn't care. They used to get these young women to come into their home. They lived in this really big home in Cromwell Street in Gloucester in southwest England, and then they would lead them down to a cellar that Fred had purpose-built for the mission of torturing and murdering these young women, and that is what the 2 of them did. They would both essay and grape them over a number of days. They would hang them upside down before eventually killing them. They had several children, 7 in total, and in fact of the 7 children, 3 were fathered by punters that Rose had in her work as a prostitute. That's something she started doing after she had her 2nd child, and she really loved it. She used to advertise, she used to go out and into the West Indian community and get black guys to come and shag her for money. Rose and Fred were in the habit of essaying their own children. In 1987, one of their children, who was 16 at the time, Heather West, was standing up to Fred saying, "No, leave me alone, I don't want you to do the thing to me." So they dragged her down to the cellar and murdered her, and it was on Rose's instigation. Fred West killed himself in prison. Rose, meanwhile, has been banged up since 1995 under a whole life order. As at the time of this recording, Rose West is on her last legs. She's getting end of life care, so she'll soon be no more. And that's the story of Rose West. Malcolm Green has committed 2 murders. The first one was in 1971 in Cardiff, and his victim was called Glenys Johnson. He was traced because he went to his workplace, a steelworks, called the police up and started taunting them about what he'd done, asking whether they'd caught the killer and saying that there would be more murders and that he was the Ripper. The police traced the call, and from there they traced him. He did time, got out in 1990, but then not long after, he killed a young tourist from New Zealand. He then dismembered the body, wrapped it in plastic bags and dumped it in different places along a road in South Wales. A member of the public saw the bags, had a look inside, called the police, and the police soon traced him. And he was initially given a finite term, again, of imprisonment, but the Home Secretary of the time later replaced it with a whole life order. Mark Robinson was born in 1962. At 17, he joined the RAF. On the 27th of May 1979, he was home on leave for the spring bank holiday. He went round to the home of one of his neighbours, a 32-year-old woman called Patricia Wagner, who was a wife and a mother. He actually tricked his way into her house by pretending that he was drunk and had mistaken the house. In any case, the two got talking, had sex apparently, according to Robinson, and it came on his instigation. But then at the end, Mrs. Wagner apparently said that if Robinson didn't tell his mother that they had just had sex, she herself would, and apparently the thought of his mother finding out what he'd done with his married next door neighbour was just too terrifying to Robinson, and so he got hold of the cord of a lamp in Mrs. Wagner's home, wrapped it round her neck and strangled her to death. In March 1989, he came out of prison having done the 10-year minimum term of the life sentence that he got for Mrs. Wagner's murder. He met a 25-year-old lady called Sharon Morley in Wakefield. The couple soon moved to Billingham, and that started lots of arguments between the couple, all because Sharon wanted to move back to Wakefield. On the 19th of September 1989, Robinson discovered a photo of one of Sharon's former boyfriends, and in the argument that followed, he beat and stabbed Sharon to death. His original life sentence, which he got in 1989 for Sharon's murder, was later upgraded, thankfully, to a whole life order. In August 1988, in the space of 2 days, a 21-year-old man from Yorkshire called Anthony Arkwright, murdered 3 people in the most horrific of ways. His victims were his elderly grandfather and 2 of his neighbours. There's also another murder that took place at the time, the housekeeper of his grandfather's. Everyone thinks Anthony Arkwright did it, but there isn't enough evidence to convict him, but it sits on his file. He stabbed one of his neighbours who used to be a teacher so many times, hundreds of times, and when he was murdering him, he was stark naked except for a mask that he had on. He had always hated that neighbour and had bullied him for ages. And then the other neighbour that he killed was a guy in a wheelchair. And again, the things he did to that man, he eviscerated him, pulled his eyeballs out and stuck cigarettes into the empty socket. He got his whole life order in 1989. Together with his partner in crime, David Mulcahy, John Duffy was known as the railway grapist. I've got to disguise certain words because of YouTube's decency policies. And then later as the railway killer. He and Mulcahy did a total of 18 grapes in the early to mid 80s, and they took place in places in and around train stations in North London. They said that they later upgraded, if you like, to committing murders because grapes alone stopped being satisfying enough to them. Duffy got his whole life order in 1988. At first he kept quiet about his partner in crime, but many years later he then dobbed Mulcahy in, and Mulcahy got jailed in 2001. He didn't get a whole life order, but he's not expected to ever get out. Victor Miller abducted, essayed and battered to death a 14-year-old boy from Hagley in Worcestershire in February 1988. He was caught, and at first he denied doing it, but then he later confessed, and furthermore he requested a whole life prison order. He also then wrote to the parents of the boy and apologised. Miller got his whole life order in 1988. Jeremy Bamber's 5 murder victims were all his immediate family, his parents, his sister and his sister's 2 kids. They were twin boys aged 6. It was all to get a 6-figure inheritance, and the murders took place at a farm in Essex, White House Farm. There are films and documentaries about it. Some people say it was a fit-up. It was definitely the sister, and in fact the police initially said it was a sister because Sheila, that's the name of the sister, was a schizophrenic, and they said it was murder-suicide. But then they found information and evidence later to say that it couldn't have been Sheila, but in fact the evidence pointed to Jeremy Bamber. He got his whole life order in 1986. Arthur Hutchinson, a triple murderer, is known as the Wedding Day Killer. He was on the run from the police when, in 1983, he gate-crashed a wedding reception at a house in Sheffield shortly after the bride and groom had left. He went into the house and stabbed to death the bride's father, and then the mother, and then the brother, and then he found the teenage sister of the bride and he raped her a number of times but didn't kill her. He was caught a few days later and was taken to trial and convicted. Shockingly, originally, he was only given an 18-year sentence. Thankfully, a Home Secretary stepped in and replaced that sentence with a whole life order. For 70s career criminal John Childs, killing people for pay was a great little earner. He murdered 6 people, he was paid to do so, and he did those murders between 1974 and 1978. Childs murdered Terence Eve in 1974, Robert Brown in 1975, George Brett and his 10-year-old son Terry Brett later on in 1975, Fred Sherwood in 1978, and Ronald Andrews later on in 1978. The man was jailed in December 1979, with the murders being committed by shooting and stabbing. Having served, as at the time of this recording, all of 51 years in prison, 4-time killer Robert Maudsley is, of course, the UK's longest-serving prisoner. Maudsley was born in Merseyside in 1953, and he had the most abusive and horrific domestic background that you can imagine. And shockingly, most of the acts of essay and violence that were perpetrated on him by his father were instigated by his mother. Eventually, Maudsley left home, tried to kill himself, became a drug addict, became a prostitute, and then in 1974 he murdered one of his punters because that punter showed him pictures of the children that he'd committed essay on. So then Maudsley was deemed unfit to stand trial and was sent instead to Broadmoor Hospital. In 1977 he and another patient murdered another patient, and that patient just happened to be a child. You know what are. They locked him in his cell for hours, they tortured him, they killed him. Maudsley reckoned that he had eaten some of the man's brain because he had pushed a spoon into the man's eardrum, and I think it had literally come out of the man's head in another place. It was later proven that he didn't cannibalise the guy, but the nickname Hannibal the Cannibal stuck with him ever since. After that murder, he was suddenly deemed fit for trial and he was convicted and he was sent to Wakefield, and sure enough, in 1978, the year after he committed the murder at Broadmoor, he committed another 2 murders. His plan for the day was in fact to commit 7, but he only managed 2. Some years after, in 1983, he was given his own special home. People call it a glass cage. I don't think it was made of glass. It was basically a prison within a prison. It was an underground cell, and he was all on his own there. And whenever he was allowed out for his hour a day of exercise, he had to have at least 4 prison guards with him. He asked at one point in the early 2000s to be allowed to kill himself by poisoning himself with cyanide. The authorities said no. He said, well, in that case, can I please have a budgie? They said no. In early 2025, he was moved to a prison which is a much more normal prison, HMP Whitemoor. He's on a special wing there, but he's not on his own anymore. He's not in this underground cage, which was literally built just for him. Apparently, he doesn't even want to get out of prison, but since he was given a whole life order many years ago, that, how shall I put it, isn't even a consideration. And that's the story of Robert Maudsley. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.